What's up, everybody? Welcome into the Brekkie NFL show brought to you by Tab. You know Laurie Horesh, you know myself, Phil Murphy. We have a third friendly face here at the Brekkie table. Liz Loza, ESPN fantasy football expert, joins us. So, Loz, we have like every time zone covered here. Liz and Loz, I'm going to have a hard time with this one. Liz, first, welcome. I guess what is your formal introduction and hello to the budding fantasy degenerate population that we have in Australia who pester Laws and I for tips. And we're like, listen, we have borne enough of the pressure and the bad counsel. We need an expert here. So I guess I'll allow you to say hello and give a little what to expect.
Well, thank you for welcoming me, and I hope that wasn't a bus throw. They can still come after you when the takes don't work out. But no, it's awesome to be here. I love that fantasy is growing globally. It's fantastic. I mean, there are different continents now that are becoming fervent fan bases, and it speaks to the reach of the NFL. But my favorite thing about fantasy, I grew up in Chicago, so I grew up a Bears fan, and I knew the NFC North inside and out. But since becoming a fantasy enthusiast, I've become a fan of the league because I'm no longer just attached to like my regional area, but can root for players all over the country and now all over the world. So I love that we can have a more expansive fan experience via fantasy football.
Phil, well, Laz, I mean, I'll let you drive the bus, man. You're the fantasy guy here of the two of us.
Well, that's what I was going to hit off right on the bat there. I mean, there's murmurs and accusations in my DMs that this is nothing short of a fantasy therapy session for a five-time, I sound like Booker T right now from the wrestling glory days, a five-time fantasy runner-up, 0-5 in fantasy finals. These are the murmurs that this is what this episode is truly about. But no, look, this is a huge week for fantasy enthusiasts around the world, but certainly in these parts, Australia, New Zealand, the international community, it's that last big weekend coming up before the season proper gets underway. A lot of people have cashed in their brownie points. This is the time they've set apart for what is the best day of the football year, the best day of the year for some folks. This is something that they build up towards. Study has been had, but perhaps not enough. Perhaps they're feeling the pinch, the sweat, the strain of cramming in the lead up. Not to mention, I mean, I woke up this morning, as you know, from my morning routines at, whatever hour my son wakes me up is going through the notifications that blow up my phone overnight from the newsbreakers of the world, the Jeremy Fowlers, the Adam Schefters, the Field Yates of the world. And with cut down day and then waiver claim day across the NFL today, it was only about 2,000 notifications deep. So we're all just trying to get our heads around it. Hence why we have turned to an expert in Liz. I guess the first seg that we want to kick off here, Phil, it's the early parts of your draft, whatever format that draft you're in, whether that's, spending, big dollar amounts in a bidding contest for high-end running backs or wide receivers or Travis Kelce, or whether that's the early rounds of a snake draft. This is where so much, perhaps not your draft can be won, but certainly can be lost. So we've got the segment here. This is building blocks or stumbling blocks. Right out of the gate, we wanted to ask Liz some players that are in that kind of top 10, top 15 rankings, ADP range at some of their positions. Who are some big names that perhaps have a little more stumbling block to them than foundational piece? So, Liz, I'll throw to you. When I present that scenario to you, what names come to mind as you pour through kind of the big profiles that dominate the fantasy discussion in the early parts of drafts?
Well, let's start big and kick it off with the actual game, the NFL's most important position, not the fake version of the game, the virtual game. But I want to talk about quarterbacks because we are now, after Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes soared and Jalen Hurts soared last year, there's an argument to maybe taking one of those top tier quarterbacks earlier than even certainly more than experts had wanted to in previous years. But there's still, you asked for the top 10 at the position. I have Dak Prescott ranked as my QB 13. He is, however, the ESPN consensus QB 10 for fantasy. So that's where I want to start. I want no part of this Dallas Cowboys situation, other than Tony Pollard maybe, but that's because Mike McCarthy loves to run the ball. Like, Kellen Moore got his rear end thrown out of the star because he, quote, lit up the scoreboard too much. Now, I don't think that Mike McCarthy is going to run the ball anymore necessarily. than he already did. And yes, it is true that the team added Brandon Cooks and Michael Gallup is healthy. And we know that CeeDee Lamb is an incredible producer. And I do like Jake Ferguson, the rookie. He's not a rookie. Jake Ferguson, who's expected to fill that Dalton Schultz role as like a late sleeper at the tight end position. But Dak ain't the dude anymore. And it's not just because of the injuries, and it's not just because of the 15 interceptions. It is because I don't think he's going to air it out. And it's also because he hasn't rushed the way we were used to seeing him run regularly. Last year, he managed just 45 rush attempts and 182 yards. That's 3.75 rush attempts per game, QB 22 for that category. And he's actually been outside of the top 20 quarterbacks in rush attempts per game since 2019. Like 2018 was the last time he was inside the top 10 in rush attempts per game for the quarterback position. So there's just not enough of a ceiling here. And for me not to, reach for even Deshaun Watson, who I think has higher rushing ability, even if he doesn't have the pass catching weapons that Prescott has.
Well, Laz, I know
Laz,
the Cowboys supporter. I know you lamented the loss of Dalton Schultz in the offseason. Those like 60, 65 receptions a year that go away. Not a huge disparity from Liz's rankings, Laz, of QB 13 to QB 10, but treading with caution. Do you agree?
Look, I'm not going to sit here and wave the flag for Dak Prescott, the fantasy behemoth in 2023, because I don't think that's what a lot of what Liz has laid out there is exactly. It's not a bad thing for the Cowboys, not for Dak Prescott to pass the ball less. But I think when you look at some of the words that Mike McCarthy has offered out about running the ball, and obviously there was not the smoothest commingling of minds and schemes between McCarthy and Kellen Moore. When it comes to what you want to see out of the Cowboys, particularly in the rushing game, they were perhaps a little hard-headed in their approach to rushing on early downs. They weren't overly efficient with it, and they're often repetitive and predictable with it. You'd like to see a little more efficiency in the run game in those situations, just a better balance, not just attempts of pass versus the run, but the timing that's done, the most effective times that they deployed Dak Prescott's cerebral skills as a quarterback, as well as the weaponry that we just talked about and that Liz outlined there through the passing game, as well as someone like Tony Pollard, who has been a metrics darling when it comes to the running back position for a long time. And we'll see with Deuce Vaughn out there as well. And Rico Dowdle, who showed promise as kind of not the second most talented back, perhaps, in that Dallas backfield, but someone who's more akin to the traditional role where Vaughn is more specific in what he does. But I think when I look at this Cowboys team and how they're set up, they're hoping for health on the offensive line, but I think something like, if you go back to the 2014 Cowboys offense, which was Romo at the time, Tony Romo might have had his best season that year, but that was not his highest output. He was insanely efficient. He was a model of passing efficiency. You go back and look at the numbers, the deep stats through that. That was one of the best overall offensive seasons that Dallas had during that tenure. There was plenty of running. That was DeMarco Murray. That was a healthy and the great wall of Dallas 2.0 in its absolute prime there. How I miss Travis Frederick every day. But that type of output, I think, is something that Mike McCarthy would be absolutely stoked to see his offense putting out there week in, week out, which didn't lead to, the Dallas Cowboys starting quarterback being a top 5, top 6, top 7 type of quarterback week in, week out. Throw in the rushing change that's happened with Dak since the injury, ideally with a bit more health. Perhaps you see him deployed that, but that's not something you can bank on, particularly the position. You're talking about that QB 10 range when you start looking at some of the upside options there, whether you're a believer in the likes of Tua Tagovailoa with health and the weaponry down in Miami, Anthony Richardson, about as sexy a name as you can get in preseason, despite the tumult going on in Indy. So, look, despite the jacket that I'm wearing, and we're celebrating Jersey Day here in the office in Sydney today, so hence why I've got the Cowboys colors on. Not that it takes much to get that going. But I completely am, despite the colors being born, I can't argue with anything that Liz has outlined there. Dak Prescott, I'm giving something away for the people drafting against me in the next 24, 48 hours. Not someone super high on my list or my wish list going into the season.
Liz, before we move on, you seemed pretty reflexive with that. He's my QB 13. He's a consensus QB 10. Other side of the coin, there's who do you have that you rate much higher than is the consensus from what we're seeing at an ADP standpoint or positional ranking standpoint amongst our other ESPN colleagues and friends, the Mike Clays of the world and Field Yates and that crew?
Well, I do. So I am a little bit higher on, I believe, Lamar Jackson. I think everyone else has Lamar behind Joe Burrow, but I am higher on Lamar. I love the change in offensive coordinator. They beefed up that offensive line. I think he'll stay healthier this season. Obviously, added more passing weapons in drafting Zay Flowers. Maybe Bateman gets healthy. OBJ could maybe have something left in the tank too. So I think that he has a higher ceiling, and I am guilty of leaning to a ceiling. I feel like in my life, I'm pretty steady Eddie, but in my fantasy life, I get to reach for that upside a little more regularly and be a little riskier. I also really like later. I mean, and it's later. I have him ranked behind Dak Prescott. I think Kenny Pickett's going to have a huge leap in year 2. I'm here for it. Statistically, first round draft talent tends to, I believe, 60% of first round draft picks at the quarterback position are able to make a massive leap in their second year. We saw it with Trevor Lawrence last year. We saw it with Justin Fields last year. So I do believe also an improvement in the offensive line there, and another year in the system. I think George Pickens is improving, and that's really exciting, though he wouldn't need to lay out for every single catch if he could just gain some separation and run a route. But that's a whole nother conversation. So I really like Kenny Pickett probably ahead of most people as well.
Well, I mean, those are two decent picks. As you look at the AFC North, it's pretty much a consensus 1 or 1A best division in the NFL. Todd Monken comes in, and we've seen all the defensive players from Georgia go into the NFL and make a splash, particularly in Philadelphia. That Athens to Philly direct flight we have set up. On the offensive side, there's no shortage of players who have been able to make an impact, and he being the offensive coordinator and QB coach at Georgia now coming up and getting that new toy and Zay Flowers outside the first round pick. And Laz, quick take on that before we move on.
Oh, I just start smiling anytime we get even a quick hat tip towards Trevor Lawrence. This is an absolute Trevor Lawrence propaganda zone, this show.
Well, just wait. Don't get ahead of yourself, because I might mention him later.
All right, I'll just pull back just for a minute there. But yeah, I think that Steelers wide receiver, like someone like Deontay Johnson, who the touchdown total turns so many people away, but it takes just a moment to reignite that kind of preseason hype that people feel, particularly perhaps at that quarterback to wide receiver connection when you see it in preseason. And those couple of deep connections that we saw Pickett hit with Pickens, as you mentioned there, and Deontay Johnson over the top there, all of a sudden people are getting flashbacks to perhaps more explosive additions of the Steelers offense. So yes, Kenny Pickett makes a lot of senses. I imagine there's going to be some knowing looks around fantasy drafts around Australia, New Zealand, around the world this coming weekend when, in this era where people are going earlier at quarterback, we've seen a shift back towards there, particularly that top half dozen. There's going to be those folks that still very committed to the late round quarterback theory, and there'll be some knowing looks amongst them when Kenny Pickett goes off the board in the double-digit rounds, and someone's going to be feeling like the smartest guy in the room.
Well, Laz, I know this is a fantasy show, but if we're brought to you by Tab, one of the most common selections for over-under win total markets is the over 8.5 for the Steelers. So it seems there is a kind of groundswell of that sophomore year Kenny Pickett, George Pickens connection paying dividends in Pittsburgh. I think we all know a draft can't be won in the first or second round. It can be lost there. If you swing and a miss, if you have the ironically bad luck, like an Andrew Luck situation from a few years ago, or something that still haunts me, taking Amon Green 3rd overall in 2005, and I think he had like 500 yards. Like, those are the kind of things that can cost you a fantasy season. Fantasy drafting is won in those mid to later rounds. So we have a segment. I thought Laz was going with a ludicrous angle. The what's your fantasy? The upthink at the end. I guess I mistook. Laz, what were you going for there? You told me it wasn't ludicrous, because I wrote something about like a ludicrous take, and you told me I was way off.
Look, it's early in the morning here. Like, starting the day with ludicrous can be pretty strong. Starting the day with Mariah Carey can perhaps be a little more of a natural way to work into an early morning. Little Mariah Carey blaring over the Bluetooth speakers while you're downing your third coffee before 6 a.m. That's just part of the lifestyle of many NFL fans down here. But we get there in the end, Phil. We often come from bizarrely different pop culture standpoints as we commingle on our segments, but we've got there in the end. So it's time for What's Your Fantasy. So this was your brainchild, but this was really looking at the meat and potatoes of the draft. We talked about the early rounds. You get into those, you kind of get into round 5 through, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. You're starting to really really build the core of your roster outside of those first flashy picks before, people start taking kickers off the board and defenses. And, we're really looking sideways at people going in. Really, it's round 9. We're in single digit rounds here. You're really going to we're going special teamers. Okay. Nonetheless, that's where you build so much of the depth of your team, the flex capabilities of your roster. So Liz, as you're going into drafts this season, looking at that chunk of the draft, you're in there, the picks are flying. Who are some of the targets that really are your must takeaways, your loves, your draft crushes that you're trying to come away from, if not every draft, almost all of them, with a couple of players that you feel are great values and you love the way that they help set up your team?
So I will first say that I am a massive anchor running back advocate. Sometimes I will zero RB it because there is so much stinking value at running back right now. The fantasy community is getting smarter and smarter, and the value at running back is getting larger and larger because more and more managers are prioritizing, particularly with the growth of PPR scoring and these quarterbacks, they're prioritizing quarterbacks and largely wide receivers, right? It is not crazy to go wide receiver in your drafts and then not even look at running back until third round. Some people aren't even looking at running back in the 5th round. Now, traditionally, rounds 3 through 6 have been called the dead zone, but I ran the numbers and let me tell you, the dead zone is very much alive in 2023. So there are a slew of running back values. Just to rattle off some names. Now, these are not necessarily my draft crushes, but you've got Najee Harris, Joe Mixon, James Conner, Miles Sanders, Alexander Madison, all falling into this dead zone and beyond, frankly. And let us remember that Ramondre Stevenson and Tony Pollard were outside of these 6 rounds last year. And that is the value that you are trying to hit on, because that kind of value and that kind of player is a league winner for you. So that being said, there are 2 running backs in this later round sandwich, meat and potatoes, if you will, of drafts that I am happily gobbling up. There you go. I don't know what I just did there.
Brekkie show was perfect.
Oh yes. So I love Rachaad White. I don't think there's a draft or a mock. Well, that's not true. In some of the mocks, I'm trying not to take him because I'm trying to learn something, which is the point of a mock. And I would encourage people to do, because you never know how your board is going to fall. But Rachaad White is someone that I am consistently targeting. I can't not do it. I think he's going to touch the ball like 18 times a game. And everybody who is not on the White bandwagon is saying, oh, but like this offense is going to be a 5-6 win team in a post Tom Brady era, wildly inefficient. I don't trust Baker Mayfield. But here's the thing. Rachaad White is a great pass catcher. And if Baker Mayfield is playing catch up, that means White is going to get some volume. Plus, I think the volume overall, and volume is still king, particularly at the running back position in fantasy. I think we're going to get pretty lucky here with him. And I think he's young and talented, and he isn't as injury prone as, say, James Conner or as dusty as Miles Sanders, right? So that is a player with upside. I am RB2ing him every day. The other guy, another young player, a second-year running back, is James Cook. He's going later than Rachaad White, so you have a little bit of time if you want to gamble, if you want to start, maybe drafting a tight end in those mid rounds. James Cook is a target for me. He's best known as Dalvin Cook's little brother, but that should not be his moniker. He is an incredible pass catcher, and he is playing on a team that was 5th in pass rate in back-to-back seasons. I want to attach myself to a running back who is part of the Buffalo Bills system. And I do think he's also going to see an uptick in opportunities. Nyheim Hines not with the team for the year. Damian Harris already dealing with knee issues over the preseason. I'm not, and obviously, I can't believe I forgot to say this part. I figured everyone knew Devin Singletary is not on the team anymore. That's 200 plus touches that have been vacated and put before Cook, who also is a home run hitter and doesn't need a ton of volume. He's similar to Tony Pollard, in fact. Right? His yards per touch can skyrocket, can clear 5. So he doesn't need a ton of volume to do a lot, but he is going to get more volume than he did last year. And so he is a player. He's actually my breakout player of the year.
Laz, you and I talked about this on our preview show a couple days ago. The I don't want to say thin nature of the Buffalo pass catchers. Right? I'm not trying to diminish what they have in Stephon Diggs, but and Dawson Knox and Dalton Kincaid, but it does kind of step down. There does seem to be a vacuum for opportunity into which Cook could step, especially in the passing game.
Yeah, I think it makes a ton of sense there. And you mentioned Damian Harris, who is a name familiar to fantasy managers, fantasy players, especially with some of the touchdown totals that we saw during his time in New England. But sometimes when we look at how a backfield is constructed, there was obvious investment there in Cook. And then you look at Damian Harris, whilst he's a big name, you look at the money that was actually outlaid to bring him in. It's not an overwhelming amount. And sometimes money does talk about the investment, even at the running back position. Talk about a narrative that's dominated so much of this preseason value for running backs. But you're looking at such a small amount of money that was outlaid. It doesn't necessarily say, hey, we're bringing this guy in to take away. You mentioned how many touches being vacated in that Bills backfield. This doesn't scream that, Harris is going to come in and dominate all of those. There's a massive opportunity there for the man that, yes, for so long has been known as Dalvin Cook's little brother, but a huge chance to step out. You touched on a whole bunch of things there, right? Like a back with, efficiency in the yards per carry in a backfield there that has seen so much workload depart with some of the personnel moves. And you also mentioned the part of the states that you've grown up in. So I want to zero to the Chicago Bears just for a quick second while we're in this part of the draft and while we're talking about running backs. And we had a show the other day, our season kickoff, and part of that show was a future Pro Bowler draft where me and Phil went toe-to-toe when we drafted players, 3 offense, 3 defense, players that hadn't ever had an All-Pro or Pro Bowl nod that we think have a chance. And the last pick in that draft for me on the offensive side was Khalil Herbert. I know that the Bears brought in Roschon Johnson, really interesting talent, 3-down capability, certainly has that power element, that size, pass blocking. The reports coming out of Texas are really good, and they've been pretty solid throughout camp as well. You talk about touches being vacated in a backfield with David Montgomery no longer there. You talk about efficiency and effectiveness. Khalil Herbert leading the NFL in rushing yards over expectation per attempt, next-gen stats, efficiency off the board. He's not the biggest back in the world, 5'9", 212-ish pounds, but still really nice yards after contact numbers. Where do you see someone, again, in that similar part of the draft, someone like Khalil Herbert? Is that someone that speaks out to you if you are going hero RB or zero RB? Or is it someone that you're still a little bit off given the draft day investment in someone like Roschon Johnson and the fact that he hasn't had more than 120-odd touches in a season before?
I think there will likely be a changing of the guard at some point over the season, right? It wouldn't surprise me to see Johnson overtake Herbert maybe around Thanksgiving, but there are 2.5 months before that happens. So to start this season, particularly, I think this bleeds back to the James Cook conversation too, because there's, some concern with a rushing quarterback that your running back is not going to see a ton of targets, right? What a rushing quarterback does do is make the running back more efficient, right? So their production is a little bit better. I will say for James Cook, we know that this is something, this rushing ability, this wild man out of the pocket thing that Josh Allen, that's so exciting and electric to watch. But like Sean McDermott is like, can you not hurt another elbow? Like we have a Super Bowl window here. Can we take it down a notch? So I do think that Cook is going to see a good number of targets as they try to curb that piece of Josh Allen's game. As it relates that same rushing mobile quarterback situation to the backfield in Chicago, it's only going to make Herbert more efficient. And as you mentioned, his metrics are pretty solid. He doesn't have the size, but I don't think when you have a quarterback as electric as Justin Fields, you necessarily need the same power that you had traditionally for your running back. So I think that Herbert will start the season as the RB1. There's an opportunity for Johnson to overtake him, but I don't see it happening, particularly with this coaching staff, frankly, until after Thanksgiving.
Liz, not to mention quickly, go ahead, Loz, go ahead.
I was going to say, not to mention that when you're just looking how you structure a draft, given the price of Khalil Herbert or the cost that it's, whether it's, a mid-round pick or then looking at Johnson, this is not someone you're having to outlay a lot either. So whilst, if you're in a league with 3 bench spots or 4 bench spots, might be a little tough to carry both of them. But if you are in a more traditional league with 5 or 6 bench spots, it's not an overly cost prohibitive move to go and get Herbert. And if you're feeling a little iffy or you're feeling like, at some point during the season, there could be, as you mentioned, a changing in the guard, go grab Roschon Johnson late. And you feel like you've got 2 talented, it's both opportunity, actual talented running backs. And as you mentioned, in a system where the lanes and the efficiency should be helped out by the fact that you've got Justin Fields, arguably one of the 2 most explosive runners of the football, the quarterback position in the league.
You could say it again and again. I'm never going to get tired of that.
Before we get to draft day decorum, and we definitely do want to talk about that, you mentioned something earlier that I wanted to follow up on. When you said talking about mock drafts and using these mocks to teach yourself things, when you see a player like a Rachaad White, this year, falling to you multiple times over in a mock draft at the same spot. How do you evaluate whether that's you having a bit of an edge and getting something that could be of value that other people just aren't seeing? How do you evaluate that versus a scenario in which, like, I should probably be waiting another round or two to pull the trigger on this guy?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I would wager that in my home league, I wouldn't take him in round 5, that he might fall. I do think the post Tom Brady narrative, particular to White's situation, is really loud, and that is the predominant narrative. And I am not as concerned about it, perhaps because I study a bit more. I also think, though, that if you look at White's ADP climb since July, people like me have been writing articles about him, and it's going up. So it's climbing. And that's one of the, like, I think this is the week, as Laws mentioned, right? Like, we're in it. You're going to draft now. But I do think it's important for managers to be mindful of what I like to call drum beats. Like, who are the drum beat players that you hear a little rumpatutun? Ramondre Stevenson, a great example from last year. Isaiah Pacheco, a great example from last year. You hear a little rumpatutun, and then it gets louder and louder and louder and louder. And that is the guy that you want to target and put him at the end of your bench, because those are the players that usually end up breaking out. It just means putting your ear to the ground a little bit more regularly.
I love it. So we do have drafts coming up. A lot of people have made their drafts, but any league I was in, I would always want to go as late as possible, avoiding, knowing after the 53-man rosters are done, no more preseason games, minimizing opportunity for injury. So for a good swath of our audience, it's not, we didn't guess with doing this fantasy show on this date. Drafts are coming up this weekend. So Laws and I were talking just, kind of off camera about those guys or girls in your draft rooms who were just, I don't know, man, their decorum's not really there with how they conduct themselves or how they pick. What for you, Liz? And this is a platform, either whether you've experienced it, seen it, or just, I have trepidation about it. What are the draft day faux pas that newer fantasy fans, especially newer fantasy participants, must avoid to integrate themselves well into their league?
For me, the number one is not auto drafting. I can't handle, like, I get it. I have 2 kids. You guys have kids. I'm busy. My kids start school this week. I guarantee nobody's busier than me, in fact, this week. And yet I make it in person or on Zoom to every single one of my drafts with a ranking. And I think it's rude. Like, I get it. We all have stuff in our lives, but everybody else is managing to be there. And I now have to wait 90 seconds, which in 2023 might as well be a lifetime. I have to wait 90 seconds for you to make your pick and let the auto draft do its thing. I understand that sometimes there are emergencies, and I know that I'm sure I'm going to get a bunch of comments about how they're more present parents or whatever. We all have cell phones. ESPN has a fantastic fantasy app. You don't have to be locked to your laptop. There is no excuse. You can be actively picking even if you are not active on the Zoom or whatever communication client you want to use. So that to me is really irritating. And finally, and frankly, I find it rude. I also think I am so weirdly triggered by people who let themselves fall victim to a positional run. I think it's a giant fantasy red flag. And while I can benefit from it, I'm always like, no, don't just draft another quarterback because 2 in a row or 3 in a row have gone off the board. Like, show a little discipline. Just go. And again, I'm rooting for myself always, right? So, like, I'm happy that this running back or wide receiver is going to drop to me, but I'm also like, don't group think this. You don't need to take Deshaun Watson the pick after Trevor Lawrence because you're afraid he's not going to be available the next time you pick. Or if he is, girl, Kirk Cousins is the QB 12 every dang year, so it's fine.
This just feels to me, I'm just seeing like really bad like high school movies and stuff where there's like a fight scene and someone's like, I don't start fights, I finish them. Don't finish runs at position, start runs at positions. If you're in a drop, know your league. Know that if you're prone to one of these leagues where runs happen, position runs, particularly at that spot, like, people get antsy at something like tight end when that first one comes off. maybe Kelsey comes off and then the next lot start to make their run and people get jumpy. Know your league and know that, particularly if you're picking maybe in a snake draft around the bend and that you've got 2 picks back to back, that you can cause some chaos there and let it run out and try and push some value down to you. But always, definitely want to be preferring to start runs rather than finish runs, because you're not finding value very often in that situation. Phil, I know you didn't ask me, but my faux pas, it's the reach guy or girl, the person in your draft that after like every second pick is yelling out reach over and over. Nobody wants to hear that. It's also something that, one, it'll definitely put a target on your back for the rest of the league, that they want to be the person that just spent the entire 2, 3, 4 hours of however long your draft goes for, 1.5 hours if you're into speedy one, just yelling reach over and over. And 2, the chance for your take to age terribly, to truly make you look like you have no idea or no concept of projecting or value or looking beyond the first 3 weeks of a schedule. So the reach person is certainly one for me. And I love a good draft day blow up in the room. It's always funny when someone gets outbid at the last dollar, or someone's clearly been waiting on someone to fall back to them and they get picked right before. It sucks when it happens to you. It's pretty funny when it happens. And, we all get a good laugh, a few lols when someone has a big blow up. Maybe they slam their hands down on the laptop. Maybe they accidentally spill a drink on themselves in pure frustration. But have the moment and then move on. Don't let the bad vibes linger. Have your little, we all feel it. We're emotional people here. Fantasy is emotional. It's why we're so invested. Have your moment, let it out. Feel the just the frustration course up and down the arm for a second, but then move on. Don't sit there the whole time pouting that you didn't get your favorite running back to sleeper that you were waiting for to slide to in the middle rounds. It happens. It's fantasy, and fantasy is just the draft is just the start of the season. You can always try and make trades. You can always be wheeling and dealing. So those are my ones. I love the emotional side of it. But don't let the bad vibes linger. This is fantasy's fun. This is one of the most fun days of the year for a lot of people. So have a good time. Feel what you feel. Embrace your feelings. Be honest about them. But let's keep it moving.
Well, nobody asked me, but I'll give you mine. And it's actually not a draft day thing, but it seems very prominent at the end of week 1. And nothing is more interesting to us than our teams and our leagues and wanting to start off on the right foot, who had a great week 1 and who might be sliding the wrong way. Nothing is less interesting to me than what's going on in other fantasy leagues. There are so many permutations and possibilities for a literally infinite number of pairings that you can have. So when Monday Night Football is about to kick off and it's Bills and Jets, I don't care that you need James Cook to get 12 points. Nothing matters less to me. So we're sitting there. I just, I'll be like, hey, James Cook, 15-yard touchdown reception. Bills look good. I'm sitting there on the sideline tweeting it out. And then like, well, I can't have him score again. If he gets 11 points, I'm going to like, nobody cares about that. And you just look like you have blinders on to the rest of the NFL. So I guess what we're saying is, don't make this more important than it needs to be. It's so fun when you find that nice sweet spot of competition, camaraderie, trash talk, having a laugh, football smarts, but admitting that, we're not the experts in this. The guys doing that are the ones who are on the sidelines. We're ones who are sitting there trying to figure out who has stats, touchdowns, and all that ahead of them. So once you find that sweet tension, this is the best time of year, and it's going to be going on for the next 15, 16, 17 weeks, depending on the structure of your league. And for all of it, I cannot recommend enough following Liz Loza on social media and the rest of our fantastic ESPN fantasy team, because it certainly doesn't end at draft night. We're going to have guys with stock up, stock down throughout the year, injury updates to sort out, roster moves to sort out, potential trades in your league, trade deadline, the real deal in the NFL. So constantly moving parts. Liz and the crew there are the best in the business, full stop. And I don't say that because I have a cartoon mouse on my paycheck. It is the real deal. Liz, thank you so much. In the busiest time of your year, making time for us here on the NFL Brekkie Show. It was a joy to have you. And we'll certainly be following your work over the rest of the season.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here. It was wonderful meeting you. And let's get you that championship this year. You have my information. You can text me, you can Slack me. I'm here. Let's manifest right now. You talked about vibes, right? I'm from the West Coast, big on vibes. Let's manifest a championship for you. You got to do your visualization work and it's going to happen.
I absolutely will. Look, my dear friends who've enjoyed my fantasy pain over the past decade, will know there's literally nothing I won't do at this stage to reverse course. Whatever I have to do to reverse the vibes that I'm getting off the fantasy gods, whether it's a sacrifice of I don't want to spoil too much, but my lucky draft day Stars and Stripes tights that have made it to certain drafts over the years. They may have made an appearance on this show before. Phil, sorry to bring that memory back up to you. Whether it's
just when I finished counseling.
We had a suggestion from one of our viewers. Do I need to roster more Saints players? At least 3. Do I need to handcuff a kicker in some sort of reverse fantasy intelligentsia mojo moment? There's a Mike McCarthy quote for everybody, but I will do anything. So I greatly appreciate the vibes being sent over here. I will work on my visualization and try, as so many out there are, to end my own personal fantasy drought. Not quite as long as the almost 3 decades of that team that I'm rocking today, but it certainly feels that long in those lonely, cold moments after a fantasy defeat.
Well, hey guys, thank you so much for hanging out with us, Liz and Loz. It's always a pleasure to talk NFL and get the 3 of us together at the Brekkie table for the first time. I hope it's not the last, but best of luck to all of you in your fantasy season. And again, for all the best fantasy updates, tips, advice, counsel, leads, thoughts, projections, keep it on ESPN.com. Thanks for watching.
What are you really gambling with?